Dave, 33, a California engineering graduate, thought a degree would shield him from bankruptcy. But his tech company made cuts, and unemployment hit him mercilessly. Unemployment benefits barely cover anything. Meanwhile, his $95,000 student loan debt accrues interest. Dave wonders how he got to the point of choosing between paying for electricity or his car payment. Even with resumes sent every day, he lives in terror of being a broke college graduate in the U.S., where studying to get ahead sometimes pushes men to financial rock bottom. The electricity was cut on Tuesday, plunging Dave's small apartment in San Francisco's Mission District into an oppressive darkness. The smell of cold pizza permeated the air, a melancholic reminder of cheap, solitary meals, while the silence, once a refuge, was now filled only by the distant hum of the street, which seemed to mock his forced quiet. The disconnection notice from Pacific Gas and Electric Company, with its yellowed paper and cold letters, felt like a final blow, the last nail in the coffin of his dignity. However, the truth was that Dave's financial freefall had been unfolding for months, without him noticing the red alert signals constantly flashing around him like emergency lights on an ignored control panel. Dave had always been the epitome of financial organization, paying bills on time, saving part of his salary, and even priding himself on his detailed expense sheet. Yet, the unexpected layoff, materialized in a short, impersonal email on a Monday morning, turned his world upside down. What was once a routine of stability, with career advancement plans and concrete dreams of buying a property in the Bay Area, transformed into a desperate race to keep his head above water, and he suddenly found himself drowned in debts that grew exponentially, while the few reserves he had evaporated like water in the California desert under the scorching sun. In his mind, an engineering degree from one of California's most renowned universities was an impenetrable armor, a guarantee of success and prosperity, not a heavy burden of $95,000 in student loans that now threatened to crush him like a dead weight, constantly pulling him to financial rock bottom. The irony was cruel, a punch to the gut. He had invested so much in his future, sacrificing years of his youth, sleepless nights of studying, and accumulating monumental debt, only to see it collapse so brutally and unexpectedly. The first sign, which Dave ignored with a dangerous mix of denial, naive optimism, and shame, was the constant feeling of anxiety when opening the mailbox. The bills arrived, each envelope seeming heavier than the last, and the money to pay them dwindled each week, turning the trivial act of collecting mail into a ritual of apprehension. Instead of confronting the problem head-on with an engineer's objectivity, he practiced financial juggling, paying one bill, delaying another, making minimum payments on his credit card, and praying, with a faith he didn't know he had, for the next influx of money, perhaps a freelance job or a new opportunity to save the day. However, this patch-up strategy only delayed the inevitable, building a mountain of interest and late fees that became increasingly steep and slippery. According to recent data from the Federal Reserve and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, over 44 million Americans have student loan debt, totaling over $1.7 trillion, and many, like Dave, find themselves overwhelmed by monthly payments that exceed their financial capacity, leading to a vicious cycle of indebtedness that seems endless. When Dave finally admitted to himself that he was in trouble, it was too late for a simple solution. The collection calls, initially sporadic and easy to ignore, became a constant, a daily torment. And each phone ring made him flinch, as if he were receiving an electric shock. His credit card bill, once a convenient tool for online purchases and occasional emergencies, turned into an uncontrollable snowball, with interest devouring any attempt at payment, causing the balance to grow even with regular payments. The reality is that most people only realize they are on the verge of bankruptcy when they are already neck-deep in water, submerged in a sea of debt with no visibility to the surface. Excessive debt, reliance on credit cards for basic expenses, a clear sign that income doesn't cover essentials, and the absence of an emergency fund are some of the clearest indicators that finances are collapsing. For Dave, the red alert came with the electricity cut, an event that suddenly forced him to face the harsh reality of his financial situation, with no more excuses, escapes, or distractions. The analysis of Dave's situation reveals a common pattern among those facing extreme financial difficulties in the U.S.: the lack of a robust contingency plan for emergencies and the underestimation of the impact of a large debt, especially one as inflexible as student loans. Even with a good job and an above-average salary in his city, life can change drastically in a matter of weeks, and the absence of a Plan B can be devastating. To avoid financial disaster, it is crucial to have an emergency fund that covers, at minimum, 6 months of essential expenses. A figure Dave now knew was the absolute minimum and not a luxury. Furthermore, it is fundamental to closely monitor debts, especially those with high interest rates, like credit cards, which can quickly erode a budget, turning small expenses into huge burdens. Ignoring financial problems does not make them disappear. On the contrary, they grow larger and harder to resolve, like a monster that grows in the darkness, fed by denial. Dave began to understand that the shield he believed he had was not a degree or a substantial salary, but rather the ability to identify warning signs early, to be honest with himself about his situation, and to act decisively before the crisis became uncontrollable and irreversible. The darkness in his apartment was not merely the absence of physical light, but an invitation to confront his own financial shadows and to begin building a new path, a path of responsibility, resilience, and proactivity. He knew he needed to change, and the first lesson he learned was the vital importance of recognizing the signs before bankruptcy became an inescapable reality, a sentence without appeal or pardon. From that moment on, Dave promised himself that he would never ignore a red alert again, transforming the crisis into a powerful catalyst for a new, more conscious financial awareness. The days of darkness and despair for Dave seemed distant, almost unreal, like a nightmare from which he had finally woken, emerging stronger and wiser. The smell of cold pizza had been replaced by the fresh aroma of breakfast carefully prepared in his kitchen, and the oppressive hum of silence by the comforting sound of the radio playing news and music that he once had no mind to listen to or appreciate. He had found a new job at a promising tech startup in Austin, Texas, a strategic move from San Francisco to a place with a lower cost of living, and a booming job market. And, although the salary wasn't what he dreamed of before the crisis, it was stable, challenging, and allowed him to breathe financially. His student loan debt, though still present like a scar from his battle, was under control thanks to consistent IDR plan payments and the extra payments he made from his freelance income. Dave wasn't rich in the traditional sense, but he was on the right track, building a sustainable financial future, brick by brick, with the wisdom acquired on his arduous journey. The final lesson he learned, and which he strived to internalize every day, was that financial security is not a destination to be reached and then forgotten, but a continuous journey of learning, adaptation, discipline, and constant vigilance. The first cornerstone Dave firmly laid for his sustainable future was maintaining a rigorous budget and performing regular reviews. The budget that pulled him out of the hole was not a static document, filed away after the crisis, but a living, dynamic tool, adaptable to the changes in his life. He meticulously reviewed it every month, adjusting it as his income increased, his expenses changed, or new goals emerged. This disciplined practice and continuous monitoring ensured that he always knew where his money was going, down to the last cent, and where he could optimize, preventing a return to the old habits of unconscious spending that had led him to ruin. Furthermore, he set clear and realistic financial goals, dividing them into short, medium, and long-term objectives. For example, In the short term, he aimed to pay off his credit card debt completely within 6 months. In the medium term, he planned to build an emergency reserve for 12 months of expenses. And in the long term, he dreamed of saving for a down payment on a house and ensuring a comfortable retirement. Having tangible goals with defined timelines and amounts kept him motivated and helped him make financial decisions aligned with his long-term plans, transforming abstract dreams into concrete and manageable steps. CNBC and the Financial Planning Association consistently report that people with clear financial goals are more likely to achieve them and maintain solid financial health, as clarity provides focus, discipline, and a sense of purpose. Secondly, Dave prioritized creating multiple income streams, a strategy he had discovered out of necessity during his toughest phase. Although his main job was the foundation of his financial security, he did not abandon his freelance activities. On the contrary, he expanded them, seeking more challenging and well-paying projects in his area of expertise. He saw them not only as a way to accelerate debt repayment and the building of his emergency fund, but also as an additional safety net, a way to diversify his earnings and protect himself against future economic crises or job losses. His blog and digital content creation projects also continued to grow, with the goal of generating passive income that could eventually cover his basic expenses, providing an extra layer of freedom and financial resilience. The COVID-19 pandemic, for example, highlighted the vulnerability of many families who relied exclusively on a single income, showing the importance of income diversification as a powerful shield against economic instability. Dave understood that security did not come from a single point, but from the interconnection and strengthening of various resource streams, making him less vulnerable to fluctuations in the job market. Finally, Dave committed to continuous learning and investing in himself, recognizing that knowledge was the most valuable asset he possessed. He continued reading books on personal finance, following economic news, and participating in online seminars and webinars on investments, tax planning, and wealth strategies. Financial education, for him, was not a course with an end, but a lifelong process, a skill that needed to be constantly honed to navigate an increasingly complex financial world. He also actively invested in his professional skills, taking refresher courses in his engineering field and learning new technologies relevant to his sector, which not only kept him competitive in the job market, but also increased his market value and growth opportunities. This self-discipline and focus on personal and professional growth were key to adapting to a constantly changing world and ensuring that he would never again be caught off guard by a crisis. The ability to reinvent oneself, acquire new skills, and continue learning is perhaps the smartest and most enduring investment anyone can make in themselves, far surpassing the returns of any financial asset. Dave was no longer the naive young man who believed a degree was an infallible shield. He was a resilient man with his mind and finances under control. Ready to face any challenge, life presented him with the wisdom of someone who had touched rock bottom and found his way back. The darkness of Dave's apartment in San Francisco's Mission District was a turning point, a moment of painful epiphany where reality imposed itself with brutal force. But the real shift occurred when he found himself staring at a computer screen, the bluish light of the monitor illuminating his tense, exhausted face, desperately searching for personal bankruptcy in the USA, how to get out of student loan debt, and causes of financial ruin. What he discovered deeply shocked him. He was not alone. Millions of Americans of all ages and backgrounds shared his anguish, their stories echoing his own, though each with its nuances and specificities. What the experts said in articles, videos, podcasts, and even self-help finance books was unanimous. The biggest causes of bankruptcy in the United States were a complex mix of unpredictable events, like job loss or unexpected health problems, and misguided financial decisions, often stemming from a regrettable lack of financial education. Dave remembered the career planning lectures in college, which focused exclusively on high-income jobs and stock investments, but never even mentioned the possibility of prolonged unemployment, global economic crises, or most, ironically, of all the suffocating student debts that could become a burden for decades. The reality was much more brutal, complex, and multifaceted than the textbooks and success seminars had painted in vibrant colors. The data, much of it from respected institutions such as the U.S. Federal Reserve, the American Bankruptcy Institute, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, painted a bleak yet revealing picture of the American financial landscape. One of the biggest causes of bankruptcy, and one that hit Dave hard like a bolt from the blue, was unexpected job loss. Statistics show that, even in a seemingly robust economy, the unemployment rate can skyrocket during economic crises or sectoral restructurings, leaving millions of families helpless, without warning or time to prepare. The lack of a robust emergency fund, the well-known financial cushion of 6 to 12 months of essential expenses, transformed a temporary layoff into a direct and rapid path to the bankruptcy hole as bills kept coming relentlessly while income ceased. For Dave, who relied on his income to cover not only basic living expenses like rent and food, but also the heavy monthly student loan payments, job loss was an electric, paralyzing shock. He had prioritized paying off his debts, yes, but he had not built an adequate emergency reserve for unforeseen circumstances, a failure that proved fatal and brought him to the brink of collapse. Another critical factor, and one he saw in many bankruptcy stories narrated in online forums, was exorbitant medical expenses. Although not directly Dave's case, every year hundreds of thousands of Americans declare bankruptcy due to uncontrollable medical costs, even with health insurance. A serious illness, an unexpected accident, can devastate the finances of any family, regardless of their income or prior planning. Healthcare in the U.S., despite all its technology and innovation, was a financial minefield where an emergency could mean total and unavoidable ruin. But perhaps the most insidious cause, and one Dave began to understand firsthand with searing pain, was student loan debt. It was no ordinary debt. It had unique characteristics and terrifying rigidity that set it apart from all others. Unlike other debts, such as credit card or personal loans, which can be forgiven or renegotiated in bankruptcy under certain circumstances, student loans are extremely difficult to discharge, even in bankruptcy proceedings, except in cases of undue hardship, an extremely stringent legal criterion rarely granted. This meant that, even in total ruin, with his electricity cut off and his car at risk of repossession, Dave would still owe that $95,000, a burden that would accompany him for decades like a constant shadow. This rigid system, designed to protect creditors and ensure the flow of capital to educational institutions, trapped millions of former students in a web of debt for decades, stifling their aspirations, preventing them from buying a home, marrying, having children, or planning for the future, and making financial reconstruction immensely difficult. The idea that studying to get ahead in life could lead to financial rock bottom was a bitter and cruel irony for millions of young Americans seeking the dream of social mobility and a better life through education. Furthermore, experts pointed to the lack of financial literacy as an aggravating factor across all causes of bankruptcy. Many, like Dave, left college with excellent degrees in their fields, prepared for high-level careers, but without the slightest practical knowledge of how to manage a budget, invest wisely, deal with debt strategically, or plan for their financial future. This knowledge gap made them vulnerable to errors that could have been avoided with planning, discipline, and a basic understanding of financial principles. Dave realized that his engineering background had prepared him to solve complex machine and algorithm problems, but not to navigate the pitfalls and complexities of the financial system. He felt naive, yes, but at the same time determined to learn and to rise again. The lesson was clear. Bankruptcy was not just a personal failure, an isolated event, but a reflection of a complex and often unforgiving system, where financial education and robust planning were the only real weapons for survival and prosperity. With every collection notice, which felt like a cruel reminder of his desperate situation, with every call from an unknown number that made him hold his breath, Dave felt the hole deepening, dragging him into an abyss of despair and anxiety. Bankruptcy seemed the grim inevitability, a sealed fate, written between the lines of his bank statements and on the warning letters that piled up on his kitchen table. However, the same research that had alarmed him with the harsh reality of student debt and bankruptcy in the U.S. also began to show a path, a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness that surrounded him. The stories of ordinary people overcoming adversity, the articles on financial recovery that he devoured eagerly, and the practical advice from experts, which once seemed distant and unattainable, began to sound like a survival guide, a manual of instructions for navigating chaos. Dave understood that getting out of the hole was not a magical leap or a stroke of luck, but a series of calculated steps, painful in their execution and, above all, intensely disciplined. He no longer had time for lamentations, for blaming the system or himself. It was time to act, to take control of his own financial life, with the mind of an engineer applying solutions to a complex problem. The first real financial recovery strategy he embraced with determination and the seriousness of a life-or-death operation, and which financial experts always emphasized as the non-negotiable starting point, was the creation of a rigorous and detailed budget. Dave used to have an informal budget, a vague idea of his income and expenses, but now he needed a sharp scalpel, not a hammer. He listed every cent that came in, his meager unemployment benefits, which barely cover basics, and a few sporadic freelance jobs he managed to secure, and every cent that went out, without exception, from rent to the cheapest instant noodle packet at the supermarket. He cut unnecessary expenses mercilessly. The daily coffee at the corner cafe, once an affordable luxury and a comforting habit, was replaced by homemade coffee. The streaming video service he barely used was canceled. Even the more expensive cell phone plan was swapped for a basic economical one. The goal was simple and brutal in its execution. Every dollar had to have a clear purpose, to be consciously allocated to an essential need or to debt repayment without deviations. This technique, though basic and often underestimated, is the backbone of any successful financial recovery, providing unprecedented clarity on cash flow. According to National Debt Relief and the Consumer Credit Counseling Service, a detailed budget not only helps identify where money is being spent inefficiently, but also where significant savings can be made, freeing up precious funds for debt repayment. Dave, in doing so, realized with shock that he was spending small amounts on various things that cumulatively represented a significant portion of his meager unemployment benefits, money that could have been used much more effectively. Any money left over, however little, was directed towards what he called aggressive debts, prioritizing those with the highest interest rates, such as his credit card, which eroded his budget most rapidly and kept him in a cycle of indebtedness. The second strategy, which required a courage he didn't know he possessed, was debt negotiation. At first, the idea of calling creditors terrified him, filling him with fear and shame. He imagined harsh, inflexible voices on the other end of the line, mocking his situation. But he read about the importance of being proactive, of not waiting for the situation to worsen until it was too late. With a voice choked by anxiety, but with the determination of someone who had nothing left to lose, Dave called his student loan provider and his credit card bank. To his surprise and immense relief, the conversation was more productive than he had imagined. Although federal student loans are extremely difficult to forgive or discharge in bankruptcy, it is possible to negotiate income-driven repayment plans. which adjusts the payment amount to your current income and family size, making it more affordable. He also discovered he could request a temporary payment deferment or forbearance in cases of proven financial hardship, especially due to unemployment. The Department of Education, through its programs, offers various options to ease the burden on struggling students, and Dave fit the criteria perfectly. He managed to reduce his student loan payments to a much more manageable level and negotiated a lower interest rate on his credit card in addition to a temporary freeze on new charges, which gave him vital breathing room and the feeling that he could breathe again. This proactive attitude, which many avoid out of fear, shame, or lack of knowledge, was crucial in preventing default and deepening the crisis. Credit experts such as those from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the National Foundation for Credit Counseling always advise contacting creditors as soon as financial difficulties arise, as they generally prefer to negotiate a payment plan rather than see the debtor go bankrupt, which would result in a total loss for them. The third strategy, and perhaps the most difficult to accept for a proud engineer with a degree from a top university, was the relentless pursuit of extra income. With expenses cut to the absolute minimum and debts renegotiated, Dave still needed more money to accelerate his recovery and build an emergency fund. The idea of doing odd jobs felt like a humiliating step backward in his career, a denial of all his academic effort. The urgency of survival and recovery outweighed any vanity or pride. He began looking for freelance work online, leveraging his programming and data analysis skills on platforms like Upwork, Freelancer.com, and even Facebook groups for freelancers. Initially, the projects were small and poorly paid, sometimes just a few tens of dollars. But the experience and positive feedback he accumulated helped him build a solid portfolio and an online reputation. This, in turn, enabled him to secure larger and better-paying jobs, such as developing small scripts for task automation or analyzing complex datasets for startups. He also signed up for food delivery apps like DoorDash and Uber Eats, spending hours driving around the streets of San Francisco, and even considered temporary part-time jobs that didn't require his degree, just to keep some money flowing regularly and keep his pantry stocked. The shame of not using his engineering degree in a worthy job was replaced by the urgency and pragmatism of surviving and rising again. The lesson learned was that financial recovery requires humility, adaptability, and an open mind to new opportunities, even the less glamorous ones. There was no magic solution or easy shortcut, but the combination of a tight and monitored budget, active debt negotiation, and the relentless pursuit of extra income were the tools he needed to dig his way out of the hole. Dave began to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and with every small victory, a bill paid on time, a freelance project completed, one less collection call, his confidence grew, fueling the once unthinkable belief that he could indeed rise again and build a more solid and secure future. As Dave's financial structure began to rebuild and the sense of control gradually replaced the panic that had consumed him for months, the phrase extra income ceased to be a desperate last resort and became a strategy for empowerment and accelerating his goals. He had already experienced the humiliation of accepting jobs below his qualifications, like delivering food for hours in his worn-out car, but now he saw the pursuit of new income streams not as a sign of failure, but as proof of resilience, intelligence, and proactivity. The digital era, which had so lured him with the promise of a glamorous tech job and, ironically, had led him to his crisis by laying him off, now presented itself as a vast field of opportunities to supplement his income and accelerate his recovery, almost like a paradox of destiny. And, with recovery on the horizon, the idea of smart investments ceased to be an abstract concept, reserved for millionaires and Wall Street financial gurus, and became a fundamental pillar for building a sustainable and secure future, a legacy he never thought he could have. The first extra income strategy that Dave deepened and professionalized was leveraging his engineering and programming skills on freelance platforms. He signed up on sites like Upwork, Fiverr, and TopTal, creating detailed profiles that highlighted his experience in data analysis, Python programming, web development, and even online technical consulting. He customized each proposal, showing how his skills could solve specific client problems, which increased his conversion rate. Although the initial projects were small, with modest pay, sometimes just a few tens of dollars, the experience and positive feedback he accumulated helped him build a solid portfolio and an online reputation. This, in turn, enabled him to secure larger and better-paying jobs, such as developing small scripts for task automation or analyzing complex data sets for startups. This approach directly capitalized on his education and experience, allowing him to work remotely and flexibly, which was essential while he sought a full-time job and managed his financial recovery. Flexibility and autonomy, once a distant luxury from his corporate routine, became necessities for his financial survival and growth. Many Americans, as shown by recent surveys from Statista and Gallup, are turning to the gig economy to supplement their income, with millions of people working as freelancers in various fields, and the market for digital skills is especially promising and constantly growing, offering opportunities that did not exist before. In addition to active freelance work, Dave explored the creation of passive income streams, a way to make money work for him, even while he slept or pursued other activities. He dedicated himself to learning about affiliate marketing, digital content creation, and online platform monetization. He started a blog, Engineer in Recovery, where he shared his financial recovery journey, his experiences with student loan debt, the lessons he learned about budgeting, and the strategies he used. Although the initial returns were minimal coming from ad clicks or a few sales of recommended products, the idea was to build a digital asset that could generate long-term income through advertisements, partnerships with financial companies, or sales of his own digital products like ebooks on personal finance. He also considered the possibility of creating an online course on engineering or data analysis topics, leveraging his knowledge to help other students and professionals, transforming his expertise into a scalable product, something that could be sold repeatedly without requiring his constant presence. Although these strategies took time and required consistency to yield significant results, they represented a fundamental step towards financial freedom, decoupling his income directly from the time he spent working, creating a more resilient and less effort-dependent cash flow. Regarding smart investments, Dave understood that, even with little money and still with debt, it was possible to start building a future. He didn't have capital to invest in high-risk stocks or speculative ventures that promised quick and unrealistic returns. Instead, he focused on exchange-traded funds, which offered instant diversification at a low cost, replicating the performance of an entire market index, like the S&P 500, without the need to select individual stocks and take unnecessary risks. He learned that, for beginner investors with limited capital, the best strategy was dollar-cost averaging, which means investing a fixed amount regularly, say $50 or $100 per month, regardless of market fluctuations. This minimized the risk of buying everything at the peak and allowed him to benefit from long-term market growth, taking advantage of dips to buy cheaper, which diluted the average cost of his acquisitions. He also began contributing even small amounts to a retirement account such as a Roth IRA, taking advantage of tax benefits and more. Importantly, the power of compound interest over time, which would transform his small deposits into a substantial sum in the future, ensuring his security in old age. Vanguard and Fidelity, two of the world's largest investment managers, frequently recommend index funds and DCA as effective and low-cost methods for investors of all levels, emphasizing the importance of consistency and long-term discipline. The lesson Dave learned from these experiences was that income diversification and smart investing were not just for the rich or those with a lot of capital, but accessible tools for anyone willing to learn, be consistent, and have a long-term vision for their money. He was building a more secure future, not just by working hard, but also by making his money work for him intelligently and strategically, planting the seeds of prosperity in a soil that once seemed barren. With the electricity reconnected and collection calls becoming less frequent, Dave's life began to take on a new rhythm, a new hope that once seemed unattainable. The feeling of being on the brink of a precipice gradually gave way to a tenuous, yet persistent, sense of control and empowerment. However, he knew that recovery wasn't just about getting out of the hole of debt and lack of money. It was about building a solid, unshakable foundation to never fall again, to shield himself against future financial storms that would inevitably arise. It was at this point that Dave plunged headfirst into the world of financial education, no longer as a tedious academic task he'd ignored in college, but as a matter of survival and, more importantly, of self-confidence. He understood with painful clarity that his engineering background had given him the skills to build bridges and complex systems, but not to build his own financial security, a paradox that haunted him and made him question his past choices. The true power, he discovered, wasn't in a full bank account or an exorbitant salary, but in the knowledge and discipline to manage what he had, to make money work for him, not against him, like a relentless adversary. One of the first common mistakes Dave identified in his own journey, and which most personal finance experts point to as one of the pillars of financial stability, was the absence of a robust emergency fund. He had a small reserve before being laid off, an amount he thought sufficient for a few weeks, but which quickly proved inadequate. This reserve was not even close to the amount needed to cover the 6 months of expenses unanimously recommended by financial advisors. The emergency fund, he learned, is the cushion that softens the impact of unexpected and inevitable events such as prolonged unemployment, sudden illnesses requiring medical expenses, urgent car or home repairs, or any other crisis that might arise without warning. Dave learned that the golden rule is to have 3 to 6 months of basic expenses saved in an easily accessible account, such as a savings account or a low-risk fund, but kept separate from daily spending, to avoid the temptation to spend it on impulse purchases. He deeply regretted not having given due importance to this reserve, which could have prevented much of his suffering and the anxiety that consumed him. Data from the Federal Reserve and the FINRA Investor Education Foundation show that nearly 40% of Americans cannot cover an unexpected expense of $400, which illustrates the financial fragility of a large portion of the population and the vital importance of this emergency fund as the first line of defense against financial chaos. Dave, after the storm, made building his emergency fund a top priority, dedicating a portion of every dollar he earned to this reserve, as if he were paying a debt to himself. Another crucial mistake he made, and which many young university students repeat with the same naivety, was the underestimation of the true cost of student loan debt. When he signed the loan papers, the focus was on the principal amount and the seductive promise of a bright future with a university degree. He had not fully understood the impact of compound interest over decades, the rigidity of payment terms, and the almost insurmountable difficulty of getting rid of this debt in case of financial hardship. Financial education taught Dave that not all debt is equal. Good debts, like a low-interest student loan for a promising career, or a mortgage that builds equity, can be an investment. But if poorly managed or with high interest rates, like credit cards, they can become an unbearable burden, a parasite that drains income and traps one in a vicious cycle. He learned about the debt snowball, paying off the smallest debts first to gain motivation and momentum, and the debt avalanche, paying off the highest interest debts first to save money in the long run. In the case of his student loan debt, the strategy was to focus on minimum payments to avoid default and further problems. while trying to pay it off as quickly as possible through extra income, leveraging income-driven repayment programs. The importance of understanding the terms and conditions of any loan before signing it became crystal clear to Dave, a lesson he would never forget and one he now felt compelled to share with others. Finally, Dave learned about the importance of long-term planning and investment diversification. His only investment strategy before the crisis was the expectation of a high salary at a tech company, something that proved illusory. He hadn't thought about retirement, nor about diversifying his assets to protect his wealth. Financial education opened his eyes to the need for a holistic view of his finances, which includes not only the present and overcoming the crisis, but also the distant future, his retirement, and the legacy he wanted to build. He began researching exchange-traded funds, which offered instant diversification at a low cost, replicating the performance of an entire market index, like the S&P 500, without the need to select individual stocks and take unnecessary risks. He learned that, for beginner investors with limited capital, the best strategy was dollar-cost averaging, which means investing a fixed amount regularly, say, $50 or $100 per month, regardless of market fluctuations. This minimized the risk of buying everything at the peak and allowed him to benefit from long-term market growth, taking advantage of dips to buy cheaper, which diluted the average cost of his acquisitions. He also began contributing even small amounts to a retirement account, such as a Roth IRA, taking advantage of tax benefits, and more. Importantly, the power of compound interest over time, which would transform his small deposits into a substantial sum in the future. The American Psychological Association points out that a lack of long-term financial planning is one of the main sources of stress and anxiety for Americans. Dave understood that financial education was not a luxury for the rich or knowledge for experts, but a fundamental necessity for anyone who wanted to control their life and build a secure future. It gave him the tools to analyze risks, make informed decisions, and, above all, feel in control of his own financial life. He knew he still had a long way to go, but now he had the map and the compass to navigate, and the unwavering confidence that he could achieve his goals.